This is yet another episode of Heydorn and Watson, and we are going to be talking this week about why Douglas social credit is not a form of capitalism, specifically laissez-faire capitalism. And you suggested, Michael, that we make this the subject for this week's talk because, of course, last week we were discussing why Douglas social credit is not a form of socialism. And so in order to sort of balance things out and complete that perspective, you thought we should go ahead and also do a show on why it's not, strictly speaking, a form of laissez capitalism either.
Yes.
Right? Now, why do you suppose that's important?
Oh, well, it's just to give the give the audience a proper understanding of Douglas social credit, and that in relation to the two opposing sides of the conventional economic spectrum, that's Marxist socialism versus the other extreme laissez-faire capitalism, or absolute free market capitalism. It's because often what happens with people with conventional economic thinking, well, if it's not socialism, it's got to be capitalism. But if it's not capitalism, it's got to be socialism.
That's right.
So today we're going to explain that Douglas social credit is neither of those two, represents neither of those two extremes, and that it offers an alternative third way economic system that transcends the two extremes.
That's right.
And provides solutions to the social and economic problems that that both those extremes perhaps raise or try to remedy.
Well, one of the things that we probably should set out for the viewers before we go any further is a definition of capitalism. And of course, capitalism, like socialism, is one of those words, one of those concepts that means different things to different people. So we had better make it clear in what sense we're using the term. And I personally think that the best definition of capitalism, of laissez-faire capitalism, is that economic system which, under the influence of the free market, of free competition, unbridled competition, creates a situation which the ownership of private productive property is concentrated more and more in the hands of fewer and fewer people. So you end up with monopolies, you end up with oligopolies, and what this means is that the vast majority of the population have no ownership in productive assets whatsoever, no meaningful ownership. And the only thing they have that they can sell on the market in order to obtain income so they can live is their labor. So you've got this separation between the owners of private productive property and the owners of labor, right? And the people that only have their labor to sell, they sell it to the property owners in exchange for a wage. And the property owners, if they work, then they would have wages or salaries, but they are also, of course, getting whatever profits accrue to that private productive property ownership. So I would say if that's capitalism, then social credit definitely is not capitalist, because under social credit, with everyone getting a national dividend on the basis of their being regarded as shareholders of their economies, shareholders in their economies, and co-heirs to the cultural heritage, everyone would be, to at least some extent, regarded as an owner in the productive property of society, in the capital of society. So, of course, we're not talking, in the social credit case, we're not talking about a direct ownership. We're not saying that people need to own their businesses or factories or anything like that. We're talking about a beneficial ownership where the benefits that accrue to private productive ownership. We're not talking about profits in the narrower sense, but rather the costs that these things generate and over and against which no income is automatically distributed. Those profits, once they are properly monetized by a national credit authority in the form of debt-free credit, those things will be distributed to everyone on an equal basis as far as the national dividend is concerned. So it would be as if everyone is a shareholder in the economy and is receiving a periodic dividend, a share in the society's profit. And on that basis, we're all part of the ownership class. No one is going to be excluded. And the proof for that, of course, is that under social credit, it should be possible in a modern, technologically developed society to live, at least survive, on the dividend alone. And so that means that people then are no longer obliged to sell their labor absolutely as a condition for economic survival, right? They've got ownership, they get a dividend on that basis, and that gives them some kind of independence and freedom as an economic actor, where they're not obliged to go into the labor market, sell their labor to whatever capital is willing to offer them, and as the condition of receiving an income and surviving. So while socialism argues in favor of public ownership, and capitalism argues for private ownership, but in practice it ends up being a private ownership that is very concentrated, we're talking about a private share in ownership, but one that's widely distributed so that everyone at least has a minimum stake in the economy as an owner. Right?
Yes.
So quite clearly, on that basis alone, we can't consider social credit to be a form of laissez-faire capitalism, given the way that I've defined it.
No, that's right.
Okay. Was there anything that you wanted to add on those to those observations, or any comment?
Well, I would add that that unlike laissez-faire capitalism, Douglas social credit, whilst it recognizes the right to private property, the ownership of private property and production, of private entrepreneurship and innovation and private enterprise, it also recognizes that the economic society of a human community is not this kind of this hyper individualistic society where every person is an island, savagely competing with each other, like wild beasts for survival, and just have an all-out sink or swim kind of game. But there is also a vital element of human existence and survival, and that is solidarity and cooperation. So of course, there is recognized there is a degree of individuality, which is very important. That is vital for a healthy human community. Have the primacy of the individual is very important, but there's also has to be a social element to the community to guide things along and to direct things toward the common good.
Right.
So that every person can be guaranteed a basic level of stability and participation in the society's economy and society.
And so one of the things, of course, that the dividend would do would be it would link economic destinies to a certain extent, right? So the idea is, if we as a community, if we're both citizens of the same country, shareholders in the same economy, then as that economy progresses and does well, every shareholder in it would derive some profit from that. So it's in everyone's best interest for the economy to produce whatever it is that we need to survive and flourish, and to do it in the most efficient manner possible. Right? We all
Yes.
benefit when that happens. Right?
Yep.
So when you create rules to an economic system which, as you say, embody solidarity, where people, by moving ahead themselves, are actually helping others, are actually benefiting others, because if I have a successful business, then the dividend payments are going to be larger than if I didn't engage in that business. And so I'm not benefiting just
That's right.
myself financially, I'm also benefiting the wider community.
That's right. So there is a direct link between the activity of your own business and as well as upon the community as a whole. So
That's right.
The whole community can benefit that. Not you have your own privately run business, which you yourself will benefit from your labors and your innovation and your entrepreneurship, but also the general community which that business is operating in will also benefit from that, from a raised dividend as a result of increased production.
That's right. And so the national dividend, of course, is something that would be implemented through a system of national monetary reform. And so this is another aspect that we can focus on just briefly in terms of how Douglas social credit differs from laissez-faire capitalism. In Douglas social credit, there is a role for the state, right? We talk about the National Credit Authority or the National Credit Office. There's a place for an organ of the state to oversee a nation's financial system, to exercise the nation's sovereignty over that financial system so that it does serve the common good and it does facilitate as best as possible the fulfillment of the economy's true purpose, right? Which I'll repeat again because it bears repeating, especially if someone's seeing this for the first time. According to Douglas social credit, the purpose of the economy is to deliver all the goods and services that people need to survive and flourish with the least amount of labor and the least amount of resource consumption. So if that's your objective on a physical level, you need a financial system that will be flexible enough and accurate enough to make what is physically possible and desirable real. And so that is where this National Credit Authority, a national financial policy, comes in. So you've got a role for the state to regulate the private banks, right? We're not in favor of nationalizing the private banks, but the private banks would have to serve this common policy that's determined by the National Credit Authority. And the National Credit Authority would also be responsible for creating and distributing the monies, the debt-free credit for the national dividend, and creating and distributing the debt-free credit for the compensated price mechanism. Right? So this regulation of the financial system and of money is a type of regulation which is not in place at present. And of course, if you talk about the United States or Australia or Canada, they're very far from pure laissez-faire capitalist economies. Right? They're mixed economies of one sort or another. But as far as laissez-faire capitalism is concerned, certainly if you're going to regulate the financial system with a certain non-monetary purpose in mind, namely a physical result, getting people the goods with the least amount of effort, then that requires that you do put some limits, you do contextualize the market. You're just not going to allow people to do whatever they want with the money system or with the financial rules. Right?
Yes.
So go ahead. Was there something you wanted to add on that particular point?
Well, if we're talking about economic freedom and the free market, the ability to take part in economic activity without inhibitions or whether regulatory or economic or with taxation or whichever, under a Douglas social credit economy, free enterprise and entrepreneurs and businesses and etc. They would actually in a lot of ways would be freer under a Douglas social credit system, because much of the negative regulatory red tape would be eliminated. Since everyone is getting a national dividend, that will really give a huge boost to startup businesses. So it'll give ordinary people the opportunity and an economic foundation and security to start their own businesses and enterprises.
Right, if they choose to do that, right.
Yeah, if they choose to do that or have a disposition towards that, they'll be even freer and more able to do that. So you could argue that perhaps the Douglas social credit system is perhaps far more laissez-faire in a positive sense, that people actually are freer to start their own businesses.
Yes, well, I think one of
their own initiative and so forth.
I think one of the ironies, and this is something, of course, we can't prove with any empirical references because we do not yet have a Douglas social credit economy up and running. But it is my own belief that if we had the social credit monetary reform in place, that actually would be the only thing that would prove to be effective in providing a feasible, workable economy that would in practice be as close as possible to what libertarian ideologues propose.
Yes.
In other words, they have this whole idea of a laissez-faire economy that doesn't exist anywhere, right? And what I'm saying is if we had Douglas social credit, and you're quite right, if we had Douglas social credit, we could eliminate much taxation, we could eliminate many of the regulatory apparatuses and regulations that have been put in place for one reason only, and that is to mop up all of the problems caused by a dysfunctional, dishonest financial system. So if you fix things at their source, if you fix the cause of the problem rather than sort of trying to modify or palliate symptoms, then a lot of that excess bureaucracy, regulation, taxation, etc., which is relied on now in the mixed economy just to make free enterprise work, you could jettison all of that. And actually, in those ways, then you would have an economy that, at least in those respects, would be closer to the laissez-faire ideal. So it's ironic, but if they want a free economy, a truly free economy, reforming the financial system along Douglas social credit lines would actually be the best possible thing you could do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the libertarians and the pro-laissez-faire ideologues would it's perhaps maybe as hard as it is for some of them to believe, that actually find their wishes and desires for a free economy fulfilled and achieved in a social credit economy where there is involved a degree of solidarity and social organization.
Yes.
Because that solidarity and social organization provides the grounds and the freedoms to encourage people's own initiative and private enterprise.
And this, I think, provides a good segue, though, to some other aspects, other differences between Douglas social credit and laissez-faire capitalism that we should highlight, and which may sour certain libertarians, but I think it might also be quite revelatory. The third point I wanted to make was that the social credit ethos is completely different to the ethos that often inheres, I wouldn't say that it necessarily inheres in sort of the free market worldview, but which is often associated with it, which is the idea that, does the economy exist for the purpose of making money? Right? Is that the natural end of the economy? Money making, multiplying figures in bank accounts. And Douglas social credit makes it very clear that no. The economy exists for a physical purpose, for a physical end, a physical objective, getting people the goods and services they need to survive and flourish, and getting them those goods and services in the most efficient manner possible, right? Which is with the least amount of labor, the minimum employment necessary, and the least amount of resource consumption, which, of course, the environmentalists should be all on board with that point.
Absolutely.
Yes. So what does that mean? It means that as far as the social credit ethos is concerned, people would not be in a position to use money to make money without contributing something of equal value to the economy in the form of goods and services, right? So there's plenty of money making in the free market, insofar as we have free markets right now, which it involves purely speculative activities, or if you think about economic rent in the case of banking, otherwise known as usury, or other instances where people view the whole purpose of their activity is to make money by hook or by crook, right?
Yes.
And that is something which and Douglas social credit would either be eliminated directly or indirectly, or it would just, by the nature of the system, would be heavily discouraged.
Yes, right? Absolutely. Yeah. And not only that, it would also eliminate or remove, at least for the most part, the whole mentality of dog eat dog, sink or swim, or just work just for the sake of work, and not work just to fight all means necessary with the least amount of trouble and labor to everyone, as you said. And it would not, people would no longer be placed in this cruel, perhaps Darwinistic meat grinder, where they're forced to not just work, but compete in work, but compete for work, for jobs,
and hence for survival,
with each other, just to survive, just to survive. And because that kind of mentality is what turns human beings into monsters.
That's right.
When they're put in a state of deprivation or scarcity, they'll use whatever unscrupulous means, whatever scrupulous means,
yes,
to achieve the goal of survival.
Right. Whatever means, fair or foul.
That's it. Right. Exactly. And it would also mean that a lot of things would be demonetized in a certain sense, that a lot of things that we pay for should really, we should not have to pay for. A lot of things we do pay for are purely just for a profit motive, and not because actually there is there's a monetary charge necessary in order to maintain that particular things, such as, for example, road tolls, toll roads on vital infrastructure that people need in order to travel to and from work, or to and from the places they need to go. They have the infrastructure that should otherwise be public property and paid for by the public taxes, which the public often does pay a lot of. We have private companies. They have these roads and bridges being leased out to private companies to place road tolls on them, to continue to charge the public even after the infrastructure has been paid off. They still charge the public for the right to use the infrastructure, And then that can often be very crippling upon especially the working poor, who have to use that infrastructure to get to and from work. So that kind of monetary charging just for the sake of profit, which is extremely immoral, and it's professional extortion and a form of public corruption, is really would have to be gotten rid of.
Well, that provides a good segue to another point. I guess this is maybe the fourth major point that I wanted to make on this particular topic, and that is that, you're talking about public infrastructure that's been sold to private companies. One of the things that Douglas talks about when he talks about the compensated price mechanism is that he wanted, and this is something he talks about very often, and whenever he brings up the compensated price, he said that companies that wanted to take advantage of the compensated price would have to agree on a certain percentage as their profit on turnover, this percentage being something that would be typical for the particular typical of the particular industry in question. So Douglas is saying that there is some need to regulate the size of profit margins, right? And in your case, for example, if that profit regulation system were in place as part and parcel of the compensated price, then companies would not be in a position to make monopoly or oligopoly profits. They would not be in a position to take advantage of consumers, because if they wanted to benefit by the compensated price of the retail desk, then they would have to agree to limit their profits on turnover, right? And I think that Douglas thought this was necessary, because if you are going to have a system where a national credit authority is going to be creating debt-free credit and injecting it into the economy in the form of a national dividend and in the form of a compensated price, there's a certain amount of danger that companies may, knowing that there's more money about, certain companies that are in a position to do so first may raise their prices to try to mop up as much of that extra credit as possible. And that means that instead of increasing consumer buying power, instead of increasing consumer purchasing power, it actually would end up just contributing to demand inflation. Right?
Yes.
So this is another way in which social credit differs from laissez-faire capitalism, this idea of the profit regulation. Now, we're not talking about price fixing. Companies, depending on their costs, would be free to increase or lower their prices so they can cover their costs accordingly as things change in the markets. And we're also not talking about limiting aggregate profits. Companies that want to make more money would simply have to sell a greater volume of goods and services, right? And if there's demand for that, then instead of just raising their prices to absorb excess demand, they'd actually have to produce more in order to get at that excess demand, which ties in with that principle I was talking about earlier, namely that you're not going to be able to use money to make money without contributing something of equal worth to the economy in the value of goods and services. Right?
Yeah.
So that would be a very important principle that would put the business of business on a different level entirely than what we have now, where companies, if there's excess demand, they're free to raise their prices, to ridiculous heights to absorb as much of that as they can. Now, people could object and say, well, then you're imposing something, but it's not a legal imposition at all. It's a negotiation. The state authority, the National Credit Authority, would say to the businesses, do you want our discount? Do you want to be able to sell your goods and services at, say, at a 20% or 25% discount? Fine. You can do that, but we want something from you in return. We want you to agree to maintain your profit margins at a certain level that we both agree is equitable for the business in question. And what that would do is it would ensure that prices are all close to the equilibrium point they would be in perfectly competitive free markets, right?
Yes.
Many people, and this is sort of a pet peeve of mine, many people, they go on about the free market. The free market has all these benefits, efficiency and the proper allocation of resources, and you've got capitalist justice where people are getting a dollar's worth for a dollar spent, and all these wonderful benefits that they associate with the free market. But as a matter of fact, those benefits only inhere in free markets that are simultaneously perfectly competitive markets. Because when you have perfectly competitive markets, what that does is it drives prices down to the lowest possible point where entrepreneurs, capitalists, business owners are only making as much money as is necessary to maintain the incentive to stay in business. They're not making huge profits. Right?
Yes.
So people seem to forget that part. I think a lot of people who are, neoliberal or libertarian, etc., they defend the free market because they themselves personally may be doing very, very well financially out of a free market that is far from perfect competition, a free market that is a monopoly
Yes.
market or oligopoly market. And it needs to be pointed out to them that those are not the types of markets that, even according to the economic orthodoxy, even according to the theory of free markets, those are not the type of markets that give us all these other wonderful benefits of efficiency and proper allocation of resources and capitalist justice and so forth. Right? So they
Yes.
conveniently forget that. There are some people, there are some social creditors who believe that competition would be sufficient to keep profits, reasonable, and that we don't need to have this profit regulation mechanism. But I am of the opinion that Douglas is correct in that, because we have tons of markets now that are monopoly or oligopoly markets, right? We can't rely on competition alone under the existing system to give us perfectly competitive markets. So it would be wonderful if that just happened automatically, but there are barriers to entry. There are all sorts of things that can prevent a perfectly competitive market from coming into existence and being maintained in existence. And so what the profit regulation mechanism would do is it would in fact ensure that all retail markets operate after the pattern of perfectly competitive markets. And
Yes.
and that's the free market ideal in its purest sense. So there should be no complaints on that level.
No. No, that's right. Exactly. It's also, I'll just point out too that a lot of these neoliberals and libertarians and people in favour of laissez-faire capitalism also argue, oh well, if we give the free market absolute free rein, there will be absolute economic freedom. Well, and it will encourage things like innovation and job creation and production. But we see even in our capitalist systems that are not purely laissez-faire, where there is a degree of absolute competition, where there's no regulation or checks on monopolies, they become exactly that. They become monopolistic.
They become unfree.
And they become unfree, and also as a result of that, they become very inefficient, and they stifle innovation.
That's right.
They stifle new inventions that would perhaps put the current economic business oligarchs out of business. And as a result of that, they also would encourage a lot of economic inefficiency. And also a lot of cronyism and corruption among the corporate structures of the businesses and so forth.
So you've got examples, for instance, where you've got situations, for instance, where companies will buy up patents of competitors because the competitor had a good idea, but the company doesn't want to deal with the threat of that competition, so they buy out the company and they they buy the patent and they shelve it so that no one can develop that particular technology or technique or whatever it is.
Exactly.
Yes. Another aspect of this too is that people on the right, quote unquote, people that support free markets and uncritically, very often don't realize that, as a matter of fact, in the mixed economies that we live in, right, that's the reality. We don't have only a certain measure of socialism for the poor, quote unquote, which these people rail against. There's also what can rightfully be regarded as socialism for the rich, in the sense that, how many companies get subsidies from the government, or how many companies have special deals with the government, which gives them an unfair advantage in the marketplace against various competitors, that might serve as a barrier to entry. Right now in Canada, we've got a situation where the Trudeau government is in a scandal because they were pressuring the Justice Minister, who is the former Justice Minister, who's or was the Attorney General, to basically not pursue a particular company, Lavalin in Quebec, not pursue them for bribery and other things that they were involved in Libya, because supposedly, they're concerned about, the company might move to a different jurisdiction and there could be job losses. But undoubtedly, there's also the question of corporate donations to political parties and favors and things like this. So you've got all these instances where the government of the day is using its power, using taxpayers' money to favor certain private entities. So how is that free market? If that's socialism, except it's not seen as such.
Socialism for the rich.
It's sort of a corporate socialism, yes. So, and there are plenty of other examples of that one could cite. But the free marketers don't generally complain about that.
Oh no, they don't. No. That's right. It's only socialism for the poor they complain about.
Yes.
So it's ironic, isn't it?
It is ironic. So there are all those various aspects of the differences. You see, I think from a social credit perspective, what we want is an economy that works, and we want an economy that works in achieving a physical result. We're not concerned with money as an end in itself, or money for the sake of money, right? Money is just an adjunct. Money would not be a commodity under social credit. Money would just be a neutral accounting device, and we can create as much of it as is needed to achieve the physical results that we have in mind.
That's right.
So when you look at it from that point of view, the free market, freedom in the market and freedom in the economy, it serves a purpose, but it serves a very different purpose from the sort of purpose that it's normally associated with it under the existing system. You see, where sort of money becomes an end in itself. Is there anything else you wanted to mention on this particular topic of how Douglas social credit differs from laissez-faire capitalism?
The only other thing I would add, and it's perhaps something we could talk more about in a future episode, is the fact that under a Douglas social credit system, with every citizen being issued a dividend, there would be the society really would then become the very orientation of the society, and the culture of the society would not be so much based on competition for money, but instead can be focused on other things, such as it can be focused on other forms of values, such as honor and the spirituality and
honor, truth, beauty. The The true, the good, and the beautiful, as Plato would say.
That's it. Exactly as Plato said, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
Mm.
And that's probably one of the most wonderful results you would see from a Douglas social credit economy. It's that society is not just exclusively based on the accumulation and competition for money.
Mm-hmm.
So, the worship of mammon, pretty
That's
much.
right.
So,
that's right.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, I think we pretty much covered all the bases there.
I think so. There are a few things that people may have questions about, and if they do,
Sure.
then please feel free to comment on the
Yes,
video
please.
and to pose whatever questions you have. And please subscribe and like our channel, and we will join you again next week, God willing.
Yes, indeed, God willing.
All right.
Okay. Bye-bye, Oliver.
Bye, Michael.